This is a story of events that changed my life forever. It made me see the world very differently. I won't say my name or exactly where all these events happened, because it would be bad for my reputation, considering what my line of work is. I can say this. I've worked for the military, and now I work in the medical field. I live in Sweden, about a 4-hour drive north from the capital. I have a lot of experience in wildlife and bushcraft and surviving in the woods, not only from my military career, but also from my childhood and the way that I grew up. I was always in the woods, mostly because my father grew up on a farm, and he wanted to raise me the same way he was. So, from a young age, I got to learn about tracking animals, seeing signs of what wildlife is around, and all the different flowers and barriers and animals there are in the forest. Most of my relatives on my father's side are hunters, so of course, I followed on their hunting trips. In the woods around where I live, there's a lot of predators, such as wolves, bears, lynx, wolverines. I've had my fair share of encounters with them, some closer than I'm comfortable with, but so far, I've never been hurt. What I want to get at is that I'm no city boy, and there isn't much that scares me in the woods. I can take care of my own self. Now back to my encounter. This was back in 2002. I was 13 years old and thought I knew everything and that I was invincible. Well, I was wrong. I was at my cousin's house, and my father was at my grandparents' house that lived about a mile away. They live in the middle of the woods. There are other houses there, but they're all pretty far apart. There is, however, a lot of game trails in this area. So during the encounter, it was about midday, and me and my cousin were bored. So we decided to take the dirt bikes and head off and just ride the trails. We passed my parents' house and onto a logging road. We've done this many times, but we were told never to go too far, just in case one of us were hurt. Our parents didn't want us too far off in case we needed help. But on this day, we went further. We went all the way to the end of one of the logging roads and found a lot of game trails. For about a mile, we traveled. But then it got too narrow. There were trees blocking our path. So we just stopped and turned our bikes around. But before we left, we sat there and ate some sandwiches. At the time, the forest was loud. Lots of birds making noise. Just as usual, I could hear a woodpecker. We sat there for about an hour, and by this time, it was almost dinner time. There was still some light out, but it was getting dark. As we packed up, I noticed everything got quiet. I mean, dead silent. Nothing was making noise. Not a bird or any other animal. It was like all the animals in the forest vanished into thin air. And then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone or something was watching us. You know that feeling you get when you're in a room and someone's watching you? Take this and multiply it by a few hundred times. That was the feeling I got. Then my cousin looked up, sensing the same thing as me. He looked at me for a minute, and then he looked past me, and all the blood drained out of his face. He went pure white. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. I turned around to look at what he was seeing, and it still haunts me to this day. I don't know exactly how far away it was. I guess about 100 yards or so. It was a bit up a hill. My brain couldn't register what the hell this thing was. It was a huge wolf, and at the time it was standing on all fours. But something wasn't right. It looked weird. The head didn't exactly look like a wolf. More like a German shepherd, with long ears that ended with little fur on the tops. But the head was bigger than anything I'd ever seen before. It was bigger than any bear or animal. and its eyes were the scariest part. Even at this distance, I could see that they were an amber color, and they were almost glowing. And this thing was looking straight into my eyes. It felt like it could see right into my soul. At this point, I felt like I wanted to puke. And then it stood up. It was standing on its hind legs. Now I realized how huge this thing actually was. It was towering above us. It had to be at least 7.5, maybe even 8 feet tall. Then it let out this growl. It wasn't the growl of any animal I've ever heard before. It was so loud I could feel it in my chest. I couldn't say anything, but in my mind I was thinking it was a damn werewolf. Right about then, I'd seen enough. I kick-started my bike, and so did my cousin, and we took off like a freaking bullet. I passed by him on my dirt bike as we took off, and I gunned it on the trail. When I looked back, I was even more scared. About 20 feet behind my cousin, this beast was running at us on 2 legs. It was looking at my cousin, like it was going to attack at any second. We got back up to the logging road, and this thing was still behind him. Now, I can't say I'm proud of what I did next. But at this point, I didn't look back anymore. I went into full flight mode, and the only thing on my mind was that we were both going to die. I can't really remember the rest of the ride after that. But I do remember, when I got to my cousin's house, I almost jumped off the dirt bike before it even completely stopped, and I went for the door. When I finally looked back, I saw my cousin coming down the road, but the monster was gone. We went up to his room right away. We didn't tell his parents anything about it, and we sat in silence for a long time. Then he told me that the thing had come right up next to him and looked right at him. It had no problem keeping up, and it was like this thing was curious on what my cousin was. He didn't attack him at all. In fact, after a while, it just turned around and went back the same way that it came. A few hours later, my dad came back and picked me up, and we went home. We live about 20 miles away in a town with about 20,000 people in it. But even there, I really didn't feel safe. We lived at the edge of town, with the highways just a few hundred yards away, and the forest was right outside of that. A few days passed by, and then we went back to my grandparents' house. We needed to help my grandma put some firewood away for the winter. I really didn't want to go back, because I didn't want to see that creature again. When we got there, everything seemed normal though. The birds were singing, and I even saw some deer on our way there. But I still never felt like I could relax. I felt like any moment now, it would get quiet and that thing would come running from the other side of the field, or come up from the back of the house. My grandpa noticed that I wasn't acting like myself too, but he didn't say anything until after dinner. I was upstairs in the office, looking on the computer for what this thing was. He came in and asked what I was doing. I felt silly, and I didn't really want to tell him what happened, but I did anyway. He calmly asked where it happened, and why we were even out there that far. He didn't look surprised, though. He looked more concerned, to be honest. So I had to ask him, "Do you believe in this thing?" He took a deep breath and told me he did believe it, because a few weeks ago, he saw it too. But he was a bit further away than we were, although he was still in the same area. He'd been out hunting and was standing at the edge of a clearing when he saw this thing. He didn't see it that well, but he said it looked like a big wolf. Bigger than normal, though, and described exactly what me and my cousin had seen, although he didn't see it on 2 feet. He thought it was weird, but maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He did leave right away, though, because he didn't want to bump into it either way. He said it's always best to stay clear of other predators. The creature hadn't noticed him, or at least didn't care he was there. I guess he was lucky. A few months passed by and I asked my grandpa if he'd seen it again, but he said no. although he thinks it was in the barn a few days earlier because he found some big wolf tracks there. I've been up to that house 100 times after that and hadn't seen anything. It got to the point where I was okay being out at night, but only sometimes. Other times, I felt like this thing was still out there watching me. I didn't see it again until 7 years later. A lot of things happened in those 7 years. I finished high school, signed up for the military, finished boot camp, and I was home on leave before going into training as an NCO. I hadn't forgotten my encounter, but I did feel a lot easier going into the woods, at least in my own town. I didn't have any problems during boot camp, and all the time we spent out in the woods there, we were 40 guys strong, and we were well armed, so that really helped with my fear of the woods. I didn't feel safe, but I at least felt safer. My mother and father had separated when I was young, so my dad still lived in that same house. It's not that big, but we do have a porch that goes around 2/3 of the house, and has a glass window and a door that you have to pass before you get into the front door. I was spending time at home with my dad, and we've been up all evening talking about what had happened during the last few months that I'd been away. We had a few beers, and got all the news of the family stuff. Told him all about my experience in boot camp and life in the military. At about 11:30, he was getting tired and wanted to go to bed. I wasn't tired, so I went outside to have a cigarette. I went out, and it was really quiet. But at this point, I didn't think much about it. I lit my cigarette and walked over to the road towards the woods. I decided right there that I'd take a leak, but midstream, I felt something was looking at me, just as I felt 7 years ago. And instantly, that same fear gripped me. Then I was hit with this awful smell. It smelled like wet dog and old stale pee. Not even finishing my business, I started walking back towards the house, still peeing, I might add, and leaving a trail over the road. Just as I reached the front porch, I saw the dogman again. It appeared in the light from the other side of the road, and once again, he was looking straight at me. He was panting like it had run for a long time. This time it was on its hind legs again, and it looked like it was grinning. It's like he knew who I was. At this point, I was about to shit myself, but I just kept backing towards the door. It snarled and dropped down to all fours. Then it started sniffing the spot where I had peed, but it never took its eyes off of me. I kept backing away to the door still, and slowly went into the house. I went upstairs to my room, and in the window at the top of the stairs, I looked out and saw it look up at me. It turned around and walked back into the woods after that. I didn't sleep at all that night. I was lying in bed, just waiting for it to crash through the window and kill us. But it never did. I don't know what this thing wants. Does it have a grudge with me? Or is it something about me that attracts it to me? It never showed itself at my dad's house again. My grandparents have since passed, but we still keep their farm and use the barn for storage. It's a place that we can keep all of my dad's and uncle's equipment. No one's there that often, though. The house is still there, but no one's lived in it for 2 years. I've been up there a few times, but I absolutely do not like going there, especially alone, and I never ever go there after dark. When I'm there, it doesn't feel like I'm welcome anymore. I think this thing expanded its territory, and now this area is his. Just a few months ago, I was there to get some stuff from my dad's house, and I swear this thing was lurking in the woods watching me. I hauled ass out of there as soon as I could. Now, I live almost in the middle of town. I am surrounded by 2-story apartment buildings. I live on the bottom floor of an apartment. I feel safer here. I have a small yard, just like all the apartments on the bottom floor do. Luckily, I haven't seen the dog man. At least that I know of. And I sure as hell hope I don't. Because if I do, I will move so far away from this town, and it will never, ever come back. As far as what the dogman looked like, its fur was dark brown. It was darker in the chest and along its back. I saw the hands pretty good on my second encounter. They didn't look human at all. The fingers were long and the claws were at least 1.5 to 2 inches long. What I suppose was the palm area also looked deformed, like it was thicker and longer. Its skin was very dark, almost black. The first time I didn't smell anything, but like I said, the second time, it was a horrible smell. The first time everything went so fast and I was on my dirt bike, the only thing I had in mind was that I was going to die and how quickly I had to get out of there to avoid dying. The legs were big and muscular, and they were jointed like a dog, but a lot bigger. It didn't have a tail. I didn't look too closely at its rear, but I'm sure it didn't have a tail. The closest resemblance of how it looked as a whole was like a mixture between the werewolves in Van Helsing, Dog Soldiers, and Bad Moon. So that's my Dogman story. Thank you for presenting it. This happened to us in spring of 1986 in Washington State when I was 13 years old. To paint a picture for you, I was the oldest of 3 children. My brother was 8 and my sister was 6. So most of the chores landed on me, and I helped my dad around the property a lot. We had a 2-story house on 3 acres of fields. The field was backed by the Tiger Mountain State Forest about a mile from our property line. The fields didn't have any vegetables or orchards or anything like that. It was just a bunch of fields that grew a lot of grass and weeds. We had a stable that housed 2 horses. In the daytime, they were out in their pasture, but at night, we would bring them into the stable area that my dad and I had built. Each horse had its own stable. Like most of the time in Washington, we were getting a pretty heavy rainstorm, so the horses were in their stables all day long. There wasn't much else on the land, like I said, just dirt and fields, so when it rained, it would get pretty muddy. One evening, it was raining very hard, and the horses were more restless than normal. They tended to get pretty restless when the storms would roll in because they were always cooped up inside. But this time, they wouldn't even stand still. They would pace around, grunt, snort, and rear their heads like something was making them nervous, like a predator was around. My parents brushed it off as a storm, but I wasn't too sure. My mother noticed that one of the horses was actually out of her stable and running around the property. So it was up to my father and myself to wrangle her back into the stable. The first thing we did when we went outside was check the stables to make sure our other horse, Ramsey, was still inside. She was still in her stable, but more restless than ever. We noticed the stable fence in Sunny's stable was knocked down and decided they would have to stay in the same stable together tonight because we couldn't fix it in this rain. We set out on foot to try and lead Sunny back to her pasture, but we couldn't figure out where she was. It was pretty dark out there, and the rain was pretty thick. So we walked along the fields, calling her name and waving around carrots to try to lure her in. On our property, we have this big fallen tree that laid across one of the fields. When it first fell, my dad was going to have it removed, but my siblings and I begged him to leave it there so we could climb around on it. This tree comes into play in a minute. It's dusk at this point, and it's getting pretty hard to see, especially because of the rain. We sloshed our way towards the tree line, since Sunny was nowhere to be found, and my dad stopped dead in his tracks. He put his hand on my chest to stop me from going any further too, and I froze. "Don't move," he told me. I was suddenly very nervous. He nodded to that old tree and whispered, "What the hell is that?" I looked over and realized what he was talking about. Standing behind the tree was this thing, but it looked like it was just casually leaning over the tree. Its arms were draped over the tree, and it was staring right at us. It looked like a giant wolf to me, except the paws were wrong. They looked like raccoon hands, like they could be used to grab things. Even in the dusk and the rain, I could see that it was enormous. It had shoulders that were broader than a linebacker, big ears like a Doberman Pinscher, and a long muzzle. It was panting, like it'd just been running for a long time. Its tongue was curled out and hanging out of its mouth. It had huge, elongated teeth that looked like it could rip you open with one bite. It was shaggy, and the rain was rolling off of its fur, which was soaking wet. My dad told me we had to back away slowly, and we started moving back towards the house. That's when this thing stood up, and it was even taller than I thought. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, and it was standing on 2 legs. Then this thing stepped over the tree. That's how tall it was. It didn't climb over the tree. It stepped over it like you would a large log when you're hiking. Its legs were massive, like a bodybuilder, but the knees were bent backwards like a dog. It started walking towards us. It was still slightly hunched over, which made it look even more intimidating. I was so scared I could feel tears running down my face even in the rain. I wanted to run, but I knew that my dad wanted us to stay calm, and I did my best to listen to his words. But each step we took backwards, this thing took 2 towards us. I thought it was going to kill us. We kept moving backwards towards the house though, never taking our eyes off of it. It never looked away from us either. The way it moved, it looked like it was getting ready to attack us. At the closest point that it came to us, I'd say it was about 25, maybe 30 feet away. Way too close to one of these things. The distance it would take with each step was more than twice the distance of our own. And my dad whispered to me that if it attacks, he wants me to run home, get the rifle, and protect my mom and my little siblings. I choked out that I wasn't leaving him, but he repeated himself. How he stayed so calm, I'll never know. But I knew I needed to listen to him. All I could do though was nod. I can remember seeing the rain just dripping off of this thing. We were soaked at this point, and this thing looked like it had been outside for a long time. Its hair was long and shaggy like a wolf, but in the rain it was flat and sticking to it, which really gave us a good look at this thing's build. It was all muscle, from the big broad shoulders to its massive arms, all the way down to its giant legs. This thing was definitely a predator, and an apex predator at that. Then, all of a sudden, this thing stopped coming towards us and just stared at us for a moment. It snarled and then dropped to all fours. This is the moment I thought to myself that we were going to die that night. But to our surprise, and might I add, our relief, it turned around and took off towards the tree line, where it disappeared into the woods. "Run," my dad said sternly, and the 2 of us sprinted all the way back home. As we were running, we heard this awful, unholy howl coming from the woods. It sounded like a mix of a howl and a scream. I kept looking back as we ran, making sure it wasn't chasing after us. We burst into the house, ignoring my mom's questions about if we found Sunny or not. My dad grabbed her by the shoulders, looked her in the eyes, and told her what we had just saw. She nodded and went upstairs with my brother and sister and stayed there. We had 4 rifles in the house. She took 1. She took 2 of our dogs also. Big retriever mixes that could hold their own, although I'm sure they would die a horrible death by the thing that was out there. Our 2 other dogs stayed downstairs with us, and we kept the rifles with us too. I could hear Ramsey neighing frantically outside, and I knew there was nothing we could do for her. My heart was broken at the thought of her being attacked, but when I looked outside, I could see she was still alone in her enclosure. She acted like that the rest of the night. We stayed up all night long, making sure that that thing didn't come for us. At about 3:30, maybe 4 o'clock in the morning, my dad said that Sunny was outside. I told him we had to go out there and help Sunny, but he refused. He wasn't willing to risk my life or his to help the horse, but I started to beg him, and finally he agreed to go out there. We went out there cautiously and slowly, armed and ready to fight for our lives, to get Sunny into the enclosure with Ramsey. That was probably the scariest 30 minutes or so of my entire life. Getting her to cooperate with me was horrible. She didn't listen to me at all, even with a bag of carrots. I truly think she had already encountered this thing and didn't want anything to do with me, the carrots, or the monster that was out there ready to attack us. The whole time I was working with her, my dad covered me with a rifle and had another one slung over his back, just in case we both needed to use them. Believe me, I didn't stop shaking the entire time we were out there. The dogs were with us, and they were acting restless too. They would whine and growl, run towards me, and then back to my dad. Once Sunny was finally in the stable, I'm fairly certain I heard more growling. You can say it was my head, or my imagination, or the wind, but the dogs heard something too, and they both started growling at the exact same time. We rushed back into the house and locked the door again. The rest of the night nothing happened. I was sure, though, that my horses would be dead in the morning. But what else could I do for them? I didn't want to leave them out in the rain so they could run and break a leg, or be captured by this thing and ripped apart as food. When the sun finally rose, my horses were still okay, and an air of relief spread over me and my dad. We had to go fix the fence that day, and when we inspected the fence, it was pretty obvious it was broken from the outside, not from the inside. There were huge tracks all over the place that looked like a wolf or a dog, even leading right up to the fence. But the scariest thing, the tracks in the mud also went up to the side of our house. We didn't ever see it again, but it took a really long time for any of us to feel comfortable being outside, especially at night. My younger brother and sister weren't ever allowed to go outside without supervision the rest of the duration of our time at that house. We didn't tell them what we had seen, just that there was a wild animal out there, and it wasn't safe for them to be outside alone. We ended up selling the property a few years later and moved to California. I, for one, was really glad to be out of there, and I could tell my dad was too. In 2004, he called me and told me I needed to rent a movie called Van Helsing. I went to Blockbuster and did just what he asked, and when I saw the werewolf in it, my heart skipped a beat. It looked exactly like what we had seen. All of a sudden, I was that 13-year-old boy in that field again. I made sure that night all the windows and doors were closed and locked, and all of the curtains were drawn. After that, I made it a point for myself to never watch a werewolf movie again. Thank you for listening. A few years ago, my dad and I were on a hunting trip together in Minnesota, where we experienced something I'll never forget. Everything started out normal. We made the 4-hour drive towards the cabin that we rent out every year for a week of hunting and catching up. You see, I moved from our home to attend college at Ohio State 2 years prior to our encounter, and hunting had always been a wonderful pastime for my dad and myself, so getting together for a week of father and son interaction was always something that I looked forward to. Anyways, it was the two of us and our hunting dog, a German pointer named Hudson. We unloaded our supplies from the truck and settled into the cabin for the evening. We had salmon that my dad had brought with us, and even gave a nice helping to Hudson. He loved it. My dad and I caught up. I told him about the girl I was dating. He told me about his work. We stayed up late, just enjoying each other's company. Finally, we decided to call it a night so we could get up early and get ready for our first day of hunting. I slept in the same room I had slept in since I was 12 and drifted off to sleep thinking about all the memories we've had there. The room itself was a nice size. It fits a queen-size bed and a sofa in without any problems, plus the dresser and a nightstand on each side of the bed. The bed is next to the door, and the foot of the bed faces a window. There is also a window on the right side of the bed. This is important information for later. The first night was uneventful until about 4 in the morning. Hudson was sleeping in the living room, and all of a sudden he started barking. I mean barking like he was about to smash through the door and attack whatever it was out there. My dad and I went out into the living room to calm him down, but he was standing at the door, hair standing up and barking like mad. My dad repeatedly tried to calm him down, but to no avail. Hudson started pawing at the door, all the while continuing to bark. I looked out the window, expecting to see a wolf or a bear or even a deer wandering around, but I couldn't see anything at all. There's a motion sensor on the front of the cabin to deter the raccoons in the middle of the night, and that wasn't even tripped. Eventually, Hudson calmed down. At least he stopped barking, but he was still restless the rest of the night. My dad and I went back to sleep, but I could hear Hudson walking around the cabin. It was almost as if he were standing guard over the whole place. I heard him come into my room at one point, sniff around, and then leave. I wasn't too unnerved by any of this. Like I said, I just figured he was barking at a wild animal that wandered around the place and then took off. We got up the next morning, had breakfast, enjoyed a cup of coffee, and had a cigarette on the porch. You know, Normal, everyday stuff when you're on vacation. We went out for our first day of hunting, but turned up disappointed and empty-handed. There wasn't even anything out there worth firing a shot at. In fact, I only saw 2 doe the entire day, and they were already running away in the other direction by the time I noticed them. Where the hell were all the deer? Frustrated and tired from a bad night's sleep, my dad called it a day and we headed back towards the cabin. I cooked that night. Steak and potatoes, and again the 2 of us laughed and enjoyed the company. We went out on the porch for another cigarette. My dad pointed out that the night was unusually quiet, and I pointed out that the day had been unusually quiet too. We agreed that something was definitely off around these woods. Then Hudson started barking again, this time even more ferocious than the last time. We went back into the cabin and tried to hush him again, but he still wouldn't listen. I have to stress at this point that Hudson is a very well-behaved dog. He went through a very long, very expensive training course. He knows his commands, and he knows that when we give him an instruction, he needs to follow it. And usually, he's happy to do so. But on this night, a whole box of treats wouldn't have stopped his barking. Again, I peered out the window, and again found nothing, except for this time, the motion sensor was on, even though it wasn't on 2 minutes before when we were outside. That's when I began to make out movement just outside the light and strained my eyes to see past the light. Whatever it was had no interest in coming into the light. In fact, it seemed to me that it was purposefully standing just outside of the light. It was on all 4s and it looked really big, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen. I told my dad I thought there was a bear outside, and he shrugged it off, rationalizing Hudson's behavior as being protective over us from the bear. I continued to watch the animal, but the movement just didn't seem right. It seemed calculated, like this animal knew what it was doing, and it was doing it on purpose. I finally got my dad to look outside, and his entire demeanor changed. He wasn't so laid back anymore. He was stiffened and agitated. "That's not a bear, son," he said to me. "Then what the hell is it?" I asked him. He was very grim and shook his head. "Nothing that should be in this forest, that's for damn sure." I was dumbfounded. My mind was racing as to just what the hell he could be talking about. Was it a tiger? A hyena? A polar bear? Who knows? I was clueless. I went over to the gun rack and grabbed my Weatherby Vanguard rifle. My dad was instantly in front of me. "You shoot at that thing, and we're gonna have one hell of a problem. Just let it do its thing and wander off like it did last night." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to ignore Hudson's constant barking. I asked him what was out there again, and he shook his head. "I don't know what it is, but it's not something that I want to piss off." I went to the window again and looked outside. The motion sensors had turned off, but I could just make out movement. It was still there. The 2 of us watched it for at least another 10 minutes before Hudson quieted down and started pacing around again. I told my dad I thought that it left, and he looked relieved. He went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 glasses, and poured us both a cup of Jack Daniels, his favorite whiskey. I sat down and pried at him some more about whatever it was that was out there, but I believe he honestly didn't know. He said he caught a glimpse of it, and it looked like a wolf, but it was just too big and bulky. We stayed up late, waiting for Hudson to go off again, but he didn't. However, the poor dog didn't stop wandering around the house the entire time we were up. After another drink, I started to feel sleepy and told my dad I was turning in for the night. I expected him to do the same, but he stayed up. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up to another round of Hudson's incessant barking. He was pawing at my door, which I had shut so he couldn't wake me up, and he was barking like a madman again. I looked around trying to get the sleep from my head and glanced at the window to the right of the bed. That's when I damn near fell out of that bed. Whatever Hudson was barking at was peering into the window, right at me. It was no wolf. This thing was gigantic. It stared right back at me, not a care in the world that I finally caught a glimpse of it. This thing was furry and black. It had yellow eyes that looked like they were glowing, ears that were triangular right on top of its head, and long, long canine teeth, and a long wolf-like muzzle. It looked to me like it was hunched over or crouching down so it could look into the window. I stared at it as it looked inside, and then the damn thing licked the screen on the window. I thought to myself it was trying to get our scent or taste or something, and that it was going to attack us. I was in complete disbelief. I was staring at a monster. I leapt out of bed and bolted out of the room. My dad was already awake, and I started yelling at him that the thing was back outside. I grabbed my rifle again, not caring about my dad's warning, and raced back into my room, determined to kill this thing before it got inside and killed us. I flipped on the light and looked to the window, but it was gone. My dad was right behind me and told me not to shoot, that it would just piss it off. I angrily asked him why he kept saying that and demanded that he tell me what was out there. He told me he thought it was a werewolf. I actually laughed and scoffed at him. I mean, they don't exist, right? But I saw it with my own eyes, and as I thought about it, it really did look like a werewolf, like from the underworld movies. He told me that when he saw it, it was standing on 2 legs, and it must have been at least 8 feet tall. At this point, I was leaning towards blind panic. I mean, there's an unknown creature outside that was big enough to rip the door from its hinges and then come in and rip the 3 of us apart, and we had no way of getting away other than running to our truck. And for all I knew, it was waiting for us to do that just so it could kill us. Hudson continued to bark, and I snapped. I started yelling at him to shut up because he was driving me crazy. I know he was only trying to protect us, but I wasn't even sure this thing even cared about the barking. All I knew was that the barking wasn't letting me think. I moved out of the bedroom into the living room again and looked out of the window. The sensors tripped again, but I couldn't see the thing anywhere. Eventually, Hudson calmed down again and all was quiet. I continued to stare out the window, watching for any signs of the creature's return. For the rest of the night, neither of us slept. We just waited. Every time Hudson got up, my body twitched, waiting for him to start barking again, but he never did. The sun rose and we cautiously went outside, obviously with our rifles ready. We made the decision to leave Hudson in the cabin, just in case. We walked around the cabin, but found nothing. I asked my dad what we would even do if we happened to find this thing. He didn't have an answer for me. We trekked out into the woods, but didn't go far into them. Still, there were no signs that a giant werewolf monster had been there the night before. I thought to myself, maybe Hudson could pick up the trail, and when I said it out loud to my dad, I heard how foolish I sounded. It dawned on me that I didn't actually want to find proof that this thing was out here, and I definitely didn't want to run into it. My dad said we should probably just go back to the cabin and pack up. I didn't have a problem with that. We went back to the cabin, packed up our things, and left without a second's thought. When I got home, I immediately started researching what we had encountered and came upon a webpage about Dogman. It fit the description perfectly. I started reading different encounters and eventually stumbled onto the land of YouTube. Last week, I found your narrative called Werewolf Woods and decided it was time to tell my story. I've read numerous reports about these things not attacking people, just scaring them. I think it was curious myself. Curious of us, and maybe even Hudson, and it wanted to see what we were all about. Why else would it stay out of the light and peer into my window only after I fell asleep? These things are cautious and calculated. They're smart and human-like. That cabin isn't always occupied, and maybe this was the first time it had encountered a human. Maybe it was curious. Maybe it was hungry. What do you think? Thanks for taking the time to read this and put it on your channel. I hope your subscribers enjoy my encounter. One night, while I was out hunting for coyotes on my father-in-law's land, I saw something that changed my view of the woods forever. It was about 6 or 7 p.m., right at dusk. I was in hunting blind on the edge of a ravine overlooking a creek about 30 feet down, and just beyond that was a cornfield. I was trying to call a few in because not a week had passed when one of my neighbor's cows was mutilated, and we all assumed that it was a coyote that did that. Well, it was getting very dark at this point, and I was about to leave when I heard footsteps walking up behind me. I called out in a low voice to my father-in-law, thinking it was him, and letting him know that I acknowledged his presence and lowered my crossbow. When I looked out the mesh window, I didn't see him, and I was confused that he didn't call back. Then I heard this sniffing noise right behind me. It was about 3 feet away. I was excited, thinking that this must be some coyote that had heard the distress call and came in to see what it was that it could eat. I turned around in my chair slowly and raised my crossbow, and then I heard this growling noise. It was so deep that I could feel it inside of me, and I felt dread fall all over me. I knew that whatever it was out there was way bigger than a coyote, because the growl was so deep. I laid down the crossbow and grabbed my gun. It was a sidearm that I always carry. I started praying, and I felt like I was in serious danger for some reason. At that point I thought to myself, I might actually have a fight on my hands. In the past, I was attacked by a wild dog. I still have scars to prove that fight to this day. And then what I saw walking away from that tent changed the course of my life forever. It popped this safety bubble that I didn't even realize that I was in. A bubble that I'd been living in my whole life pertaining to hunting and spending time out in the woods. I looked at this wolf creature that was walking away on its hind legs. It was moving from my blind along the edge of the ravine. It disappeared out of sight when it jumped down in that ravine. When I exhaled, I hadn't even realized that I'd been holding my breath. I was shaking. This creature had to be taller than me. I'm 5'10". It was hunched down while it was walking, so it looked smaller than it was. Standing upright, I bet it was over 7 feet tall. It had dark gray fur. It was very defined in muscle, especially on its back, which was heavily muscled. Because of the way that it was walking, hunched over like, I couldn't see its head, but I could see the tips of its ears over its back. They seemed pointed. It had these long arms that looked like they ended in hands, not claws. I never saw its face. It did have legs like a canine, though. I wanted to run as fast as I could out of there, but I felt frozen and in disbelief. Because I also still wanted to stand still. I wanted to be ready in case this thing came back. I readied my things, took a minute to breathe deep, and then finally and slowly left my blind, keeping my firearm up and sweeping the area as I moved to my truck. That was the hardest thing to do, not run. I wanted to full sprint to there. It was about 300 yards away. But it was getting dark quickly. I did not want to be out there late with this thing. At last, after what seemed like forever, I made it to my truck, and I got out of there as fast as I could, not even minding the speeding limit. After that, I've struggled for a long time, and still do to this day, with what I went through. It's hard to talk to other people about it, especially my family. They would think that it was a case of mistaken identity, or that shadows were playing tricks on my eyes. They're practical people. They believe in science, not what goes bump in the night. It's comforting to know after researching that there are other people out there that have seen things like this. There's people there like you that share their stories and get the message out that these things are not figments of our imagination, that they actually exist. After that, I did have another encounter with this thing. It was about 2 years after my hunting incident. I moved into an old house about 10 miles away from the land that I saw that thing on. And for about a week, my 2-year-old daughter would tell me about this bad wolf that was outside. She just kept on and on about this bad wolf, and I started to get concerned. I thought about the night that I saw that creature. I told her to come get me if she ever saw it again. At about 8 o'clock one night, she came to me, saying, "Bad wolf outside." I went to her room with her. It's on the 2nd story, and she told me to look out the window. We have floodlights out there. We also have a large chicken coop and a run about 50 yards back. And then about 10 more yards after that is a wood line. So I'm looking out the window, trying to see anything. And at first, there's nothing. I was scanning the yard back and forth, trying to find this bad wolf that she kept talking about. I looked around the coop. Nothing. I thought about maybe it was my neighbor's dog trying to get to the chickens. But still, I saw nothing. And then finally, as I glanced to the woodline again, I saw this thing. It was a large wolf creature, standing on 2 legs, just like before. And it was staring straight at us. It was standing behind this large wooden cross that I'd put up. That cross is about 9 feet tall. This creature wasn't much shorter than that. I was frozen again. But now, I was also angry. This thing came to my home. It was standing on my property, scaring my kids. It was watching my family, my little girl, my son. Who knows for how long? This creature was on my territory this time. I scooped up my daughter, and I looked right back at this thing. We were in a staring competition, it felt. It had these large yellow eyes that looked like they were glowing in the floodlight. I grabbed her and I called to my son. We went to my room as I tried to stay calm. I put both of them in my bed, went to my gun safe and grabbed my rifle. I went to the window. But now, this thing was gone. I didn't sleep much that night, and I actually had the kids sleep in bed with me and my wife. I was staring out that window most of the night. I've never seen it again. I pray I never do. I live near Circleville, Ohio. Thank you for sharing this story on your YouTube channel. I've sent this story to other people, and I've also posted it on Reddit, just trying to get my message out there that these creatures do exist. I wouldn't be surprised if other people have heard this story before, but the more people that know it, the better. Like I said, this was in Ohio. I know there's dogmen here, especially in Germantown, and I know there's other hot spots around there too. Stay safe out there. There's more in the woods than you know. Have a good night. Anonymous. This happened to us in July of 2016 at our home in Ontario, Canada. One night, around 2 a.m., I wake up to the sound of our trash cans being knocked over. Now, we do have raccoons, coyotes, and other wildlife rummaging through the garbage every once in a while, so it's not uncommon for this to happen. And I am a pretty light sleeper, so any noise like that is bound to wake me up. Our bedroom is on the first floor, and we have a window that faces into the backyard, and after the backyard is a line of trees. I'm laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to go back to sleep, but I keep hearing the trash cans being moved around. And at one point, it actually sounds like the trash can is being dragged across the driveway. So naturally, I think it has to be a bear. I got to the window and looked through the blinds, but I didn't see anything at first, although I could still hear the trash cans being moved around. As I'm gazing through the window, I finally see the shadow, and I'm thinking to myself, because of the size of the shadow, that it's definitely a bear, but it looks like the bear's on its hind legs. Then I see a silhouette of a figure in our driveway. It wasn't the size of a bear. It actually looked slimmer, maybe the same height, but not as bulky. So I think maybe it's a person instead of a bear, and I go outside with my shotgun and place it right next to the front door. I wanted to go and see what all the noise was about, and if it was somebody, I wanted to chase them off. I looked at the trash cans that were knocked over, and this was confirmation to me that something was definitely going through it. And then my thoughts that it was a person quickly went away, because why would a person be going through our trash can at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night? I set the trash cans back up, and just as I'm going back towards the house, I hear something. Now, I can't tell if this noise was behind me or to my left, so I turn around and I look both ways. I didn't see anything, but then I hear something running behind me on the other side. I spun around very quickly. I thought maybe it was an animal approaching me, and I didn't want to get caught off guard. But again, nothing was there. I could tell, though, that something had just ran into the bushes because of the way that they were moving. It must have been something fairly large, too, because the tops of the bushes were moving. I took a couple steps towards the bushes, and then I hear this very deep growling noise. This couldn't be a coyote, and it definitely wasn't a deer, so at this point, I'm thinking it has to be a wolf. I don't want to tangle with a wolf, especially because my shotgun is back up on the porch, so I slowly back up and go into the house. I watch out the window for a little bit longer, but didn't see or hear anything, so I decided to just go back to bed. If it was a wild animal, it could go through the trash. I didn't care. I'd let it do its thing. I'd just clean up the mess in the morning. I didn't see or hear anything the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside to see if I could find any evidence of what this animal could be that was out there, but the only thing I could find were these indentations in the grass that looked like something big might have been laying there. Other than that, Nothing was out of the ordinary, and the trash cans that I set back up the previous night were still standing up. That night, though, we hear a large pack of coyotes howling, which, again, is not an uncommon thing where we live. But then there was this sound that drowned out all of the coyotes. It sounded like a very deep, very loud, roaring, howling combination noise, and it went on for quite some time. I've been hunting most of my life, and I've never heard anything even close to that before. I went back outside with my shotgun to see if I could see or hear anything, but again, the night was still and quiet. For the rest of the night, we didn't see or hear anything, and we ended up going to bed without any issues. Nothing got into the garbage that night, and nothing got into the garbage or woke me up for 4 nights after that. But 4 nights later, we were in bed. My wife was already asleep. I was just about ready to doze off, but this sound catches my attention. It sounded like this deep snort and sneeze combination, and it was right outside of our bedroom window. Because of how deep this noise was, it woke me straight up, and again I'm thinking maybe it's a big wolf or a big bear. Then I hear something walking on the back patio just outside of our door. I go to the window again, and can't see anything at first. The thought crossed my mind that maybe it was our 22-year-old son, but that thought quickly vanished, because he's not fool enough to show up this late at night and walk around outside our property knowing that I have a shotgun. I listened more as the steps go from our porch to our yard, and I moved into the living room to get a better look. I had my shotgun with me again, and I peered out the window that faces the backyard. That's when I saw this massive wolf. It was on all fours at first, and scratching at the area where we try to grow strawberries. I watched this thing for maybe 2 minutes, and I remained perfectly still the entire time. I didn't even put the shotgun down the whole time. I didn't want to make any noise and possibly alert this creature to where my presence was. And then his ears twitched, like he heard something, and he perked up. My breath caught in my throat, thinking he knew exactly where I was. But luckily, he looked off into the forest, and I realized that he was listening to something in there. Then, the most unbelievable thing happened. This guy stood up on its back legs and started walking around. To me, it looked very comfortable being on those 2 legs, and the way it moved was very stealthy for a creature so massive. At this point, I got a very good look at it, and the only word I can use to describe this thing is werewolf. It walks right past my truck, still on 2 legs, and its head was over the top of my truck. That's why I got a very good judge of how tall this thing was. It had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. It walked right down the driveway and towards the forest. It had dark black hair with little bits of gray tips towards the ends, but that could be the light shining from the living room and reflecting off the fur. It had very strong-looking legs, very long arms that went down almost to its knees, and the head looked perfectly like a wolf, only massive. I watched as it went into the tree line and disappeared. For the rest of the night, I stayed up and looked through the windows, straining my senses to see if this thing was coming back. I was so confused as to what it was that I saw, I couldn't even form words to tell my wife the next morning. Eventually, I told her what I saw, and she knew that I was serious. She simply asked me what it was and what it wanted. I didn't have the answer for either of those things. I know it's been back here since then, too. What do you think is going on? A sighting of something that scared me so bad that I'm having trouble sleeping brought me here to YouTube. This happened 2 months ago on Falls Creek Trail in Alaska. I've never posted it, nor told anyone until now. I'm native to West Virginia, but my relatives are part owners of a pipe threading company in Anchorage, and they invited me to come and stay during Christmas holiday. I wanted to check out Alaska, so my aunt recommended Falls Creek Trail. I'm ex-military, and I was born and raised in the hills. I've hunted and killed every animal known to science, not for trophy, but for necessity. I've never ever seen anything remotely like what I've seen on that trail. I'm not sure if my sandwich brought him, or if it was my scent. I often follow streams while walking, because you can sneak up on wildlife way easier if the wind is in your favor. Animals rely on their ears a lot too, and the sound of the stream drowns out your footfalls, so this animal could have already been there. I'm not sure. I was 3 miles deep on the trail and decided to sit by a fairly big stream to rest and have lunch. I was sitting there relaxing to the sounds of the stream and eating my sandwich when I was interrupted with some very loud sniffing sounds, with deep, deep exhales ending in a growl. I thought maybe it was a bear, so I stood on a rock that I was sitting on to scan the area. I spotted him about 50 yards to my right. At first, just his hind part was visible, and I could only see his thigh, butt, and hocks. They were huge dog legs, and believe it or not, a human-looking butt, complete with cheeks, except there was a shaggy tail about 3 feet long. It looked like an 800-pound German Shepherd when it finally made itself known. Its paws were the size of 2 fists side by side, and I knew I wasn't looking at any bear. I stood motionless, watching and listening to this thing sniffing the air. I knew it was gathering information about me. It took a step up, and that's when I saw the monstrosity as a whole. It had its mouth open and its head up, still sniffing, and once it did that, it pegged me and looked right at me. Then, it stood up on 2 legs. I was literally paralyzed. We stared at one another, and I think we were both trying to figure out each other. As it was standing there, it had one arm behind the tree and the other hanging down at its side. It was hunched over a tad, and its legs were massive, definitely built for power and speed. Its face was almost identical to a German Shepherd. Its ears were long, pointy, and had hair coming off the tips of them. Its skin was gray, and it looked like it had mange. Its eyes were deep orange or amber, and I could see intelligence in them. Its mouth was open and dripping spit. It looked surprised that I was there, and its teeth were very intimidating. They were yellow-stained. It had shaggy fur like a lion's mane that ran along its head and covered its chest. Its stomach was sunken in, but its chest was massive. Its paws were like a dog's paws, but it had fingers with 2-inch claws. Its fur was black with silver tips. This ordeal probably only lasted 30 seconds, and it took a few steps back while staring at me, dropped onto all fours, growled, and then galloped off into the forest. The growl sounded like it was on a damn megaphone. It started low and slowly, then built up to a massive growl. I felt it in my chest. The way it ran on all fours was with both arms extended out together, with both back legs coming towards its arms, just like a dog. If that thing wanted me, it could have gotten me easily. There's no outrunning that thing at all. I know this doesn't make sense, but I've been wrestling with my mind for months now, trying to figure out what it was. It looked menacing, but also surprised that I was there. I didn't hang around to do any measurements on the size of it. I was too scared. I know now that the grizzly isn't the king of the woods, and I'll never be caught in the dark of the woods again. Thanks for letting me tell my story. Has anyone seen this animal? I've been listening to channels like yours for a few years now, trying to figure out the best way to present my story. I'm a big fan of you, Vic Cundiff, and Dark Waters. I think you guys are the best out there, and maybe one day, if I decide to go public with my encounter, you or one of them can interview me. But for now, I think I'll just send you an email of my short encounter. I believe I encountered a dogman a few years ago. Tell me what you think. My brother and I were driving back from Amarillo to White Deer in September of 2009. It was about 5 p.m. or so, and the sun was low. We were on Highway 60 when it happened. I was driving, so I was concentrating more on the road than our surroundings. But my brother is one of those guys that likes to take in the scenery when we drive. Really, I think it's just his excuse to not have to drive. But that day, I'm glad it was him watching out the window, or we might never have seen it. At first, my brother was just kicking back, watching the fields go by. But then he sat up and leaned forward to look through the windshield. He asked me what that was, but I didn't know what he was talking about, so he pointed over to something, and I looked. In one of the fields, this big creature stood on 2 legs, facing us, like it was watching us go by. "What the hell is that thing?" he asked me again. I slowed down so we could get a better look, and we stared at what was right in front of us. It looked like a huge wolf, standing on 2 legs. And even as far away from us as it was, we could still tell that this thing was huge. It had a big head, and I could make out the ears on top of it. It also had really long arms that were hanging by its sides, and really long legs. The abdomen looked like it was pretty long too, which might be why it was so tall. It looked like maybe it was a dark brown color, but the way the sun was glaring, I can't be certain. I slowed to a stop, and we pulled over on the side of the road to stare at this thing for a moment, trying to figure out if it was a wolf, or a bear, or something else. This thing just stared right back at us. His chest was moving up and down, like he was panting. I was really getting the creeps, and told my brother we should get back in the car. Then another car drove past us, and, I'm guessing, saw the same thing that we did, because not only were the passengers' eyes as huge as saucers, but they sped up and got the hell out of there as fast as they could. I guess that was enough to scare the dogman off, if they even get scared. Maybe it was just bored. Either way, it dropped to all fours and took off further into the field. Me and my brother jumped back in the car after that and took off too. This thing was fast as hell, and if it decided to come back after us, we sure as hell weren't about to be waiting there for it. I've honestly never seen something move so fast my entire life. And the way it ran was just like a wolf or a dog. I didn't know what we had seen until I got home and did some research on my computer. I learned about the Beast of Bray Road and the Michigan Dogman, and the descriptions that people gave about both of them seemed to fit the bill. My brother and I still talk about it to this day. I'm convinced that it was a dogman, but he's not so sure. So I'd really like it if I could get everyone's opinion here, so I can show them that I'm right and these sort of creatures are real. So please tell everyone to comment on this video when you post it, so I can hear what they have to say.